shares the story.
When I moved into my first apartment, I felt excited. The building was old, quiet, and mostly filled with older residents. My unit faced a small courtyard with a single tree. Across from me lived a man I noticed almost immediately. He stood at his window every evening, staring straight outward. He never opened the window or moved the curtains aside. He just stood there, motionless, watching the courtyard silently. At first I thought he enjoyed the view after work, but he stood there every night, regardless of weather outside. Rain, wind, cold, he always stayed in the same spot. I tried waving once just to be friendly and polite. He didn't react, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge me at all. He kept staring past me like I wasn't there completely. I told myself some people were simply awkward or reserved, but something about his stillness felt deeply unsettling to watch. The way he stood was perfectly rigid, almost unnatural sometimes. His arms hung straight down, never shifting or adjusting position. Each night he appeared around 9, like following a strict schedule. It felt less like a habit and more like an obligation. Sometimes I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. One night I returned home later than usual from work. Lights in the courtyard were off because of a power issue. Only the pale glow from windows lit the surrounding area weakly. When I looked across, he was already standing at his window, but this time his head was tilted slightly downward toward me. He wasn't watching the courtyard anymore. He watched my window. Not blinking, not moving, just staring directly into my room. I stepped away from the glass and turned off my lights. Even in darkness, I felt his eyes following my movements inside. I couldn't see him anymore, but he definitely saw me. For the next week, his behavior grew even stranger at night. Some evenings, he stood closer to the glass than before, his face almost pressed against the window, expression unreadable entirely. He still didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge anything, just watching something only he seemed able to focus on. I tried ignoring him, closing my curtains before 9 every night. But one evening I forgot and looked out by accident. He wasn't at his usual position inside his apartment window. Instead, he stood outside in the courtyard beneath the tree, facing my window directly in total darkness without moving. My heart dropped as soon as his silhouette registered fully. He stood barefoot on the cold grass, arms hanging downward, his face tilted upward, watching my window with disturbing intensity. No light touched him, yet I could see his outline perfectly. I backed away slowly and locked every door in my apartment. The next morning I checked the courtyard expecting some evidence, but the grass was dry, untouched, without a single footprint. He appeared in his window later at the usual exact time, standing and staring as if nothing unusual happened yesterday, like he never went outside or left that single position. I asked my neighbor about him during laundry room conversation. She looked confused when I pointed toward his apartment window. "That unit is empty," she said in a quiet, careful tone. She explained the tenant passed away nearly 3 months earlier. The apartment was locked since then, waiting for family clearance. I told her someone still stood there every single night. She insisted nobody lived there and no one had access. Later that evening, I checked again at exactly 9 o'clock. He was there, standing perfectly still, staring into the courtyard. Staring through a window he shouldn't be standing behind anymore. I moved out the following month, without explanation to anyone. Sometimes at night I still feel watched through closed curtains silently, and sometimes I imagine him standing outside beneath that tree again.
Second story.
When I moved into my new apartment, everything felt normal initially. The building was old, but the neighbors seemed friendly enough. My unit sat at the end of a long, carpeted hallway. Only 2 other apartments existed on that floor besides mine. Everything stayed quiet during the first few weeks of living there. Around the 3rd week, something strange started happening nightly. At exactly 2:40 a.m., my doorknob began turning very slowly, not rattling, not shaking, a careful, deliberate twist, the kind someone makes when checking if a lock opens. I froze the first time it happened, unsure what to do. The turning stopped after a few seconds of quiet testing. No footsteps followed, no voices, no retreating movement at all. Whoever tried the handle moved away silently without any trace. I checked the peephole, but saw only empty hallway carpet. No shadows, no figures, no sign someone was ever there. The next night, the exact same thing happened again. At 2:40 a.m., the knob twisted slowly back and forth. This time the pressure increased, like someone tried harder. Still no knocks, no whispering, no attempt to speak. Just slow, patient testing, as if timing my reaction carefully. I asked the 2 neighbors if they walked the hallway nightly. Both denied it and looked genuinely confused about everything. Neither seemed like someone who enjoyed late-night pranks. One of them even worked night shifts across the city. The other was an older woman barely leaving her unit. For several nights the twisting continued at the same time. Always 2:40 a.m., always slow, always incredibly patient sounding. I started sleeping on the couch so I could hear better. Each night the sound grew clearer, more deliberate, more practiced. The metal inside the mechanism clicked softly under pressure. One night I decided to wait right behind the door. At 2:39 I stood there holding my breath tightly. When 2:40 arrived, the knob turned exactly on schedule again. I grabbed the handle from my side and held it firmly. Whoever stood outside felt the resistance and stopped instantly. But instead of leaving, they placed a hand on the door. I heard slow dragging across the wood, downward and patient. 5 long passes, like someone tracing fingers from top downward. Then nothing. Complete silence in the hallway for minutes. I waited, listening, unable to move or breathe normally. Finally, I gathered courage and looked through the peephole slowly. The hallway appeared empty, lit by dim, flickering ceiling lights. But a faint shadow rested on the carpet near my doorstep. Not a full figure, something low, wrong, and crouched oddly. Before I focused, it slid quietly out of view instantly. I stopped checking after that night, too afraid to confirm. Instead, I added a second deadbolt and a door bar. But at 2:40 a.m., the turning continued regardless of reinforcements. The handle no longer moved far, just enough to test. Someone only wanted to know if I was still awake. A week later, I woke up at the same exact time. This time the doorknob didn't turn, didn't shift, didn't move. Instead, soft footsteps walked slowly past my apartment door. They stopped at the neighbor's unit directly across the hallway. Then I heard the same twisting sound coming from their lock. The next morning I checked on the neighbor, out of concern. She said she heard nothing and slept through the entire night. But the fresh scratch marks around her doorknob said otherwise. Thin lines circled the metal like someone tested different angles. She didn't believe me, insisting she simply bumped it earlier. The building manager installed a new hallway camera the next day. He said break-ins happened occasionally in older complexes sometimes. That night, the doorknob turned again, but much quicker this time, like someone nervous, impatient, or afraid of being recorded somehow. The pressure increased, then stopped abruptly in complete silence. The next morning, the manager knocked on my door unexpectedly. He looked pale, tense, and strangely uncomfortable while speaking. He said the camera footage recorded nothing the whole night. No movement, no shadows, no person in the hallway. But the audio captured my doorknob turning at exactly 2:40. He said the sound came clearly, but nobody was visible. The hallway stayed completely empty the entire 5 minutes. We reviewed the footage twice, then both silently agreed. Someone tried my door every night, someone the camera couldn't see. I moved out that weekend, unable to stay another night. But every morning around 2:40, I still wake up naturally. And sometimes I swear I hear faint metal turning in silence.
That story.
When I bought my first house, the neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, and friendly people walking dogs daily. Only one neighbor stood out immediately, the woman behind my yard. Her house backed directly against my fence, separated by tall pines. I rarely saw her during the day, except through quick glimpses. She moved strangely, always hunched forward, like carrying invisible weight. Her hair hung unevenly, covering most of her face constantly. But what unsettled me most was her behavior after sundown. Every night around midnight, she went into her backyard quietly. Not to smoke, not to relax, but to dig. She carried a shovel bigger than she was physically. She stabbed the ground repeatedly with slow, deliberate movements. She never looked around, never checked her surroundings once. She dug small holes all over her yard without clear purpose. Then she covered them again, patting the soil perfectly flat. At first, I thought she gardened late because of busy days. But she never planted anything, watered nothing, harvested nothing. Just digging, filling, smoothing, then digging again somewhere else. Sometimes she laughed quietly while working, barely audible at all. A slow, shaky laugh that didn't sound happy or amused. One night I stepped outside to take out the trash. She stopped digging the moment my door clicked behind me. Her shovel froze mid-air as she listened without turning. She didn't breathe, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge my presence. Only the echo of my footsteps moved across the yard. When I tossed the trash and stepped back inside, she resumed. Same exact rhythm, same slow, deliberate movements, same sound. It was like she paused herself, waiting for me to leave. The next morning, I checked her yard from my upstairs window. Every hole she dug had been perfectly flattened by sunrise. A few days later, I heard scraping much closer than usual. This time it came from directly behind my fence line. I peeked through a knot in the wood, carefully and quietly. She stood only a few feet away, digging another shallow hole. Her face twitched between movements like fighting an internal urge. She whispered something to herself repeatedly while working. I couldn't hear clearly until she leaned closer to the fence. Her voice carried one phrase over and over without variation. "It has to stay quiet." She whispered it with steady, almost practiced control. I backed away from the fence, heart pounding painfully fast. Her shovel stopped instantly, as if she sensed my retreat. She turned her head slightly, though not enough to see me. Her breathing grew louder, almost intentional, like waiting. I didn't move until the scraping sound resumed again. That evening I approached another neighbor for information casually. He warned me to keep distance and avoid interacting with her. He said she lived alone and behaved strangely for many years. Local police visited her house multiple times for noise complaints, mostly because of digging sounds late at night during every season. One night around 2 a.m., I woke to heavy thumping sounds. Something hit the fence repeatedly, shaking loose dirt downwards. I approached my window and looked toward the backyard cautiously. She stood at my fence, hitting the boards with her shovel. Not violently, just enough to test the structure repeatedly. Then she stopped and turned her head directly toward my window. Even from that distance, I saw her eyes reflecting faintly. She raised her shovel and pointed the handle straight at me. Not threateningly, more like acknowledging she knew I watched. I jumped back, nearly falling, heart racing with fear. By morning, I inspected the fence for possible damage quietly. Fresh scrape marks covered multiple planks, all at shoulder height. Deep grooves formed a strange pattern, almost like deliberate lines. Someone dragged the shovel across the wood repeatedly overnight. The marks all pointed upward toward my bedroom window. Later that week, I heard digging again, but deeper this time. The shovel struck something solid in the dirt near her porch. She whispered angrily, hitting the ground harder with force. I glanced through the fence opening and saw something unsettling. She uncovered an old wooden box about the size of luggage. She stared at it for several minutes without touching anything. Then she covered it completely, smoothing the soil very carefully. She looked toward my fence again, as if checking my location. Her head tilted slowly, unnaturally, for several long seconds. Then she whispered the same phrase again, in a shaking voice. It asked to stay quiet. I moved out 3 weeks later without telling anyone why. The new owners probably think the neighborhood is peaceful, but sometimes I dream of her digging under different moonlight, and sometimes I wonder what she buried before smoothing everything flat.
Story 4.
I used to live in an older apartment building downtown. The halls were narrow, carpeted, and strangely echoey at night. Only a few people lived on my floor, mostly quiet students. But one neighbor stood out immediately because of his strange routine. He lived 2 doors away and rarely spoke to anyone. He never caused trouble, never made noise, never acted aggressive. But every single night he walked the hallway repeatedly. Not for exercise, not for restlessness, just slow, deliberate pacing. Always at the exact same time, without a single variation. He started walking at 3:17 a.m. and ended at 3:32 a.m. The first night I heard soft footsteps outside my door. I thought someone came home late or visited another unit. But the footsteps continued for exactly 15 minutes, nonstop. Slow, evenly spaced steps, moving back and forth continuously. By the time they stopped, I was wide awake and uneasy. The next night, the same thing happened at the same minute. I checked the peephole and saw him walking past slowly. His head was slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the carpet. He didn't look left or right, never breaking his pattern, just walked the same path over and over without pause. This continued every night, without exception, for 2 weeks. Sometimes he whispered under his breath while walking slowly. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone sounded strained. Other nights he dragged his fingertips along the wall. The sound traveled down the hallway like a soft scraping. One night I finally asked him if everything was okay. He stopped walking and turned toward me very slowly. His eyes looked hollow, unfocused, like staring through everything. He said he couldn't sleep unless he followed the pattern. He didn't explain what pattern or why it mattered so much. His voice sounded rehearsed, like repeating someone else's words. After answering, he resumed walking as if our conversation never happened. Same pace, same direction, same strange, unwavering routine completely. At that point, I felt something was seriously wrong with him, but I had no idea how wrong until the following week. One night, the footsteps woke me earlier than expected. I checked the time and saw it was only 2:50 a.m. He walked earlier than usual, pacing faster than his routine. His footsteps dragged slightly, like he limped or struggled walking. When he passed my door, I heard low whispering again. Something about his voice sounded off, too many syllables, like he repeated words he didn't fully understand naturally. I looked through the peephole and saw him moving strangely. His shoulders hunched more, and his head tilted unnaturally sideways. He walked past my door 3 times before stopping suddenly. He turned slowly and stared directly at my peephole silently. He didn't blink, didn't breathe heavily, didn't shift weight, just stared for several seconds, as if recognizing my presence. Then he leaned closer until his forehead nearly touched the door. I backed away immediately, heart pounding so hard it hurt. After a minute, his footsteps continued again down the hallway. This time they were faster, uneven, and clearly distressed sounding. I called building security, explaining the situation nervously and briefly. They checked the hallway 15 minutes later, but found it empty. No neighbor walking, no sounds, nothing unusual anywhere around. The next day, I asked the landlord about him directly. He looked confused when I mentioned the neighbor's apartment number. He said nobody lived in that unit for almost 4 months. He claimed the previous tenant moved out after a personal emergency. The apartment remained vacant since then, awaiting basic repairs. I told him someone walked from that unit nightly consistently. He unlocked the door and let me look inside that afternoon. The apartment was empty, dusty, cold, and completely gutted. No furniture, no belongings, no signs of recent habitation anywhere. But the carpet inside had a visible worn track pattern. A narrow path ran from the front door to the hallway, exactly the length he walked every night for weeks. The carpet fibers were pressed down, darker, and more compacted, just like the hallway path where I watched him pacing. But nobody had lived in that apartment for months. That night the footsteps didn't return at 3:17 a.m., or at 3:32 a.m., or any time for the next few days. Then 1 week later they started again without warning. But this time they didn't stop after 15 minutes exactly. They continued for hours, pacing the hallway endlessly and tirelessly. I moved out within 3 days, unable to handle the noise. But sometimes I wake up at 3:17 without checking the time. And sometimes I swear I hear slow, dragging footsteps outside again.
Story 5.
When I rented a basement unit last winter, I felt relieved. The price was cheap, the location was quiet, and everything worked. The only strange detail was a large air vent overhead. It connected my unit to the apartment directly above mine. I didn't think much of it during the first few days. The neighbor upstairs walked heavily, but never spoke to anyone. I heard footsteps, furniture scraping, and occasional muffled humming. Normal sounds, nothing that bothered me or caused concern. But on the fifth night, something changed in a disturbing way. I heard breathing coming through the vent extremely clearly. Not regular household noise, breathing aimed directly downward. Slow, steady inhaling, followed by long, measured exhaling breaths. It sounded close enough to be inches from the metal grate. I turned off my TV and listened carefully for confirmation. The breathing stopped immediately the moment my room went quiet. I stood beneath the vent waiting for more sounds silently. For almost a minute, nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing shifted. Then something scraped lightly against the inside of the duct. A soft, dragging sound like fingernails sliding across metal. It moved slowly back and forth, as if testing length. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and checked the vent. The slats were dusty, except for two clean, thin streaks, like something pressed against the metal recently from above. I backed down, trying to convince myself it was rodents, but rodents didn't breathe deliberately or pause when ignored. The next night I heard whispers drifting through the vent. Not words, not language, just breathy, fragmented noises, like someone trying to mimic speech without understanding meaning. I called the landlord to ask about the upstairs tenant. He said a middle-aged man lived there, quiet and reclusive. I asked if he ever complained about the shared ventilation system. The landlord said no and ended the call quickly afterward. Something in his tone suggested he disliked that tenant deeply. Around midnight, the breathing returned, closer than the previous night. This time it came with soft rhythmic tapping on the vent. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap. Always the same pattern, always perfectly controlled and intentional. I turned off the lights, thinking darkness might discourage him. But the tapping grew louder as soon as the room dimmed, like he reacted directly to my movement below the vent. I took my blanket and tried sleeping on the couch. But even from there, I heard occasional whispered sounds overhead. Short, dragging noises, scratching, and low, vibrating breaths. It felt like he followed my position through walls somehow, listening, adjusting, responding to every tiny sound I made. At 3 a.m., I woke to a single loud clang. The vent cover rattled violently like someone yanked it downward. I stared at it in pure shock, heart pounding painfully hard. A shadow moved behind the slats, blocking dim hallway light. Something large shifted its weight inside the ductwork above me. I called the police immediately, barely forming sentences while whispering. They arrived 20 minutes later and inspected the upstairs unit. The tenant wasn't there, and the apartment appeared completely empty. No furniture, no dishes, no belongings, nothing indicating residency. But the carpet had a large rectangular indentation near the vent, like someone placed a heavy box or piece of furniture there, directly above the position where I slept every single night. The duct interior also had fresh scratch marks on metal, long thin lines running toward my vent as if reaching down. The officer asked if I ever saw the tenant personally. I realized I hadn't seen him once since moving in. Not entering, not leaving, not collecting mail or packages. The landlord confirmed he hadn't paid rent for months. He said he assumed the man still lived there quietly. But nobody could explain the sounds, the breathing, the scratches. That night I stayed at a friend's house instead of returning. When I grabbed my things the next morning, I checked once more. Dust around the vent was disturbed again, freshly smudged overnight. A faint fingerprint streak marked the metal directly in center, too large to be mine and too fresh to be old. I moved out that weekend and never looked back again. But sometimes when my room gets quiet at night, I still freeze, because I swear I can hear slow breathing coming from overhead. Thank you for listening to these stories. If anything even remotely similar ever happened with your neighbors, tell me in the comments. Sometimes the person living closest to you is the one you understand the least. Your like and your comment help the channel grow in the dark. And if you want more true horror every week, make sure you subscribe. If you haven't seen the previous video to 5 true forest horror stories, watch it next. It's one of the coldest collections I've made. Stay safe tonight.